the new interim pastor here of the Deerfield Community Church, United Church of Christ. It is my privilege and my sorrow to welcome you to this service. But this is a service of remembrance, of thanksgiving, and celebration for the life of Robert W. Mann, who we knew mainly as Bob. And so I invite you to enter knowing that your hearts are filled with sorrow, but also knowing that we will celebrate Bob as he was and who he was in all his wonderfulness. It is my privilege today to welcome two colleagues as guests in leading the service. One is well known to many of you since he has been the organist most closely associated with our own organ here at DCC, George Bozeman. Thank you, George, for being with us this afternoon. George has been a dear friend of Maureen and Bob's for a long time. Our second guest is now a retired former pastor of the community church in Northwood, Nottingham, one of those ends around here, and a professor at UNH, Reverend Ben Fowler, also a longtime friend of Bob and Maureen. I thank you both for participating in today's service. Please note that during the service we will have a time of sharing brief remembrances of Bob. You will be invited to take a moment to share with the gathered congregation if you desire to do that. We won't take everybody, because if you look around, you'll see that if everyone spoke even for a brief moment, we would be here for a very long time. So please think about whether or not you'd like to say a few words here, and then indicate so by putting up your hand, and I will happily bring you the microphone. But please do keep your comments very brief so that others may have time to share. We'll also continue sharing with one another memories and stories of Bob as we greet Maureen and other family members during the reception, which follows in our Great Hall. You can get to the Great Hall through this door or through the back door and around this way to the side entrance of the Great Hall. Dear friends, it is an awesome thing to come into the presence of God and to call upon God's holy name. For God's ways and God's goodness are greater than all we can imagine. But we may come with confidence this day and every day, because we are all created in God's image, and each and every one of us is beloved by God. Let us enter now into a time and the spirit of worship. They're recorded in the prophet Isaiah. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will help you. I will strengthen you. I will uphold you with my right hand. Here where God's presence has been experienced by so many over such a long time in this community, we come and we are free to grieve, to share tears and laughter and sighs too deep for words. We are free here to give thanks to God as we remember the gift of life that we all knew in Bob. We gather this day as God's people to comfort and support one another, and we hear words of hope that can lift our sorrow and move us to give thanks and praise. We gather to commend to God the life of Bob Mann as we celebrate the good news of Christ's Easter resurrection and the promise that it holds for all of us. We hear about that promise in many ways, and one of those is in music. So I invite you now to join in singing 4 verses of our opening hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You. You'll find it on the insert in your bulletins. Please stand as you are able.
and offer it back to us in loving memory. Allow him to be here with us today to experience the depth of our love as we acknowledge his life. Let him now live eternity in peace through our hearts. It is this we ask in your presence. Amen.
The words of Scripture bring comfort and provide help for all of us in making sense of our lives, or in challenging what sense life makes. This is especially true in the well-known passage from Ecclesiastes that Maureen has asked me to read this afternoon. This is chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to hurt and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to let go, a time for discard and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the busyness that God has given everyone to be busy with. God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, has put a sense of past and future into their minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for all people than to rejoice and do good as long as they live. Here ends our reading.
I have known Bob and Maureen for close to, I would say, 12 years now. I first met Bob when he and Maureen began coming to the community church in Nottingham, at which I was the minister. He and I maintained a relationship after I left the church, having an occasional lunch together, sharing music and jokes, and mutually whining about politicians and the debacle of the current political atmosphere. Many of our interchanges were on Facebook. I believe we hit it off so well because we had much in common. And as I spoke with Maureen in preparation for today, this became eminently clear. Most of you probably do not know, and perhaps might not even suspect, that Bob went to Worcester College in Ohio initially to study to be a Presbyterian minister. As a youth, Bob found solace in the church. You might not be surprised, however, that after having given a sermon as a standard minister at age 20, Bob was both terrified and horrified when so many of the people in the congregation were inspired by what he said. Bob would not let himself accept that at age 20, people could believe that he had the wisdom to lead a flock to a deeper spiritual place. So he abandoned the idea of ministry and went on to study psychology and philosophy. This does not mean that Bob abandoned his deeper spiritual search. My conversations with him revealed a spiritual life filled with questions rather than answers, and his always curious mind appreciated a debate about religion and spirituality. It was rare for him not to comment on my sermons, almost always with a keen insight. He did not, however, think of the world in terms of good and bad, but he was more of a right-wrong kind of thinker, basing his comments on what was clearly a strong humanistic moral code. After abandoning a master's degree program in Iowa, Bob moved to the Boston area. And here is another way Bob and I connected. We were both rock and rollers. Bob's brother had a band going through multiple name changes, including Ill Wind. Just the kind of ironic name Bob would love, I think. Initially, Bob was asked to join the band because he had a van. Typical, in my experience, of many a roadie. Bob did play several instruments: keyboard, banjo, baritone, trombone, but at one point his brother needed a bass player. So Bob took on the task of learning the bass, and from scratch he learned both the instrument and 50 songs in a week. Quite a feat. Takes me a week to learn half a song. But in a way, this describes Bob to a T. He was an all-in kind of guy who met challenges with an eye towards doing the best job he could at whatever he undertook. While living in an apartment in Roxbury, the band would practice at all hours of the day and night. As you might imagine, the neighbors were not overly enamored with this. So when Bob found out that the government money was available for some home rehabbing in the neighborhood, he bought a house, borrowed some money from HUD, and began his career in construction, and as a landlord, eventually ending up with 2 other houses acquired from a friend. Most people will do anything for a band. His all-in, do-it-right way of being, Bob apprenticed himself to a building contractor and to an electrician to learn the skills necessary to become licensed in both areas. This set the pattern for his future. His quick mind and his ability to think in 3 dimensions made learning by doing easy for Bob. And when busing came to Boston in the late 70s, Bob and Maureen sold the Roxbury properties and moved to Woburn, where Bob began his next career as a machinist, once again apprenticing himself to learn the trade. Why machining? Because Maureen told me he had so little money that he often made his own tools. So why not get good at it? In a way, I suspect that machining was another way for Bob to express his creative side. He was a creative problem solver and loved the challenge of figuring out how to do things that other people could not do. He loved solving puzzles of all kinds, and as a machinist, created specialized cutters for flute makers and prototypes of various things for industries. He was never a production kind of guy, but someone who could be counted on to make a good one-off item that others could not make. He marveled, that is to say, he shook his head in skeptical wonder at one project he did for the Flying Farfans, a circus act. They commissioned to make a flying saucer-like device that would spin the gymnasts around by the legs or the arms. And he wondered aloud to me how they managed not to just get flung off into the distance by the centrifugal force. Tennis became a passion for Bob a bit late in life, but not so late as to see him going full bore again. As he improved, he and Maureen eventually started attending tennis camp in North Conway. Bob was not overly agile on the court, but he had a mammoth reach which served him well at the net, no pun intended. And he had a very powerful serve. He and his team eventually went to the Nationals and placed in their age category. And as Maureen wrote in the obituary, he called himself the best mediocre tennis player you might know. When tennis became too much, he eventually set up a ping pong table and played regularly with a friend. Bob and Maureen never traveled much. Bob always liked where he was. But over the past few years, they had accompanied another family member on cruises. Bob himself told me that he was surprised how much he liked these cruises, though I have to wonder if finding a bunk long enough for him was an easy thing. When he was a kid, his family would travel to a family camp on Lake Cabasaconte in northern Maine, but the property eventually went out of the family and Bob became a home lover. Those of you who know Bob might be surprised to learn that politics is a relatively new thing for him. He only really became politicized after 9/11 when we entered the war in Iraq. This is another instance of Bob's right or wrong way of thinking. It was right to go into Afghanistan, but it was wrong to go into Iraq. From that time on, Bob carried signs and did whatever he could to support the politicians he felt were worthy of election, especially Marine. Though Bob cast a rather imposing countenance, he was really a very kind and gentle soul. He gave to the community, often bringing lights to liven a performance at the local coffee house or jackhammering an entrance to the addition in the library. He spearheaded the making of a temporary faux stained glass window to grace the Nottingham Community Church, though it is still temporarily there. When he discovered that his friend George Bozeman was doing several organ recitals on Prince Edward Island, he offered to be the chauffeur for the trip, making it possible for George to focus on his music. Once a roadie, always a roadie. But this time it was not because he owned the van. It's because he had a big heart and he loved organ music. Now there are, of course, a million things I have not said about Bob. But here's what I do know. He was smart. He was thoughtful. He was loving and creative. He was humble and unassuming. He loved a good debate, yet he had an open mind. I will miss him because I believe I could have learned many things from him, from the practical to the abstract. I am sure many of you feel the same way. In many ways, Bob personified what I said almost every week to my Nottingham congregation. His mind was clear, his words were truthful, his heart was loving, and now we can be sure that the Spirit will always pass through the ground on which he walks. I will now ask some speakers to come up. There are 3 people who have been asked to speak. Phil Nugent will come first. Okay, you may come up here.
You know, Bob was a special person, an exceptional friend. As was mentioned earlier, Bob was always volunteering to help, from senior lunches to fix computers, even medical. He had a twinkle in his eyes when he was helping. You could see it. He was really loving it. We were introduced to Bob and Maureen by a Democratic intern. And she said to us, "I have the perfect couple for you to meet." She was right. We became instant friends. We had a lot of fun and a really good time, from trip to museum, lunches, canoe trip in the summer. But dining and discussing the news, being together was a highlight of the day. Bob was really a special person. And I want to say thank you, Bob, for being such a friend. We will sincerely miss you.
I think Ben copied my paper. I can't believe I'm standing up here in front of all of you today for 2 reasons. The obvious one, the reason we're all here. I'm sure as all of you, as am I, are having a hard time with this reality. The other is I'm scared to death of public speaking. Have you ever met someone in your life that you've only known a relatively short time, but you feel like you've known them your whole life? This is how it was with Bob and me. Bob was a lot of things, and if you spent any time with him, you know he was a smart, gifted, generous. I saw firsthand some of Bob's generosity, whether it was a farmer friend that needed help making ends meet, or a neighbor down the road that obviously needed some help. Bob was there. He was a politically opinionated person, but I'm not going there. He was a good human being. Bob loved to tell stories, and there were almost always some aspect or time of his life that he wanted to share with you. Whether it was tales of him as a young man working the barges up on the Great Lakes, or his adventurous trips that he would take to Panama back in the 60s. Or the days of just picking up a bass guitar and playing in some of Boston's, let's say, not so upscale drinking establishments. The stories would seem unbelievable, and he left me at times with my eyes blinking and my jaw hanging open. But he knew they were always true. Most of his stories, one way or another, included his brother Carrie, a person he talked about often. When Bob wasn't telling stories, he was telling jokes, and I enjoyed his sense of humor. We would sometimes share jokes we heard or saw via Facebook. I came across one the other day that made me think of Bob, and I would share it. I stayed up all night to see where the sun went, and eventually it dawned on me. Bob and I worked together, keeping his old Case tractor running, and he had a name for it. He called it Justin. Just in case. Bob loved. He loved his dogs, Kristen and Olive. He loved music. He loved games, puzzles, table tennis, playing bridge, listening to George Bozeman play his music on his organ. He loved riding motorcycles with Maureen out back of the house on the fairgrounds. But most of all, he loved Maureen. A while back, when Maureen was having some health issues, Bob confided in me that he was scared. He was scared that something serious could be wrong with her and that he couldn't fathom life without her. But it is her and all of us now that must live our lives without Bob. I was talking to Maureen the other day, and at the end of our conversation, she told me to make sure I hugged my wife, Barbara, and I did. Because as my dad has reminded me, we know not the day nor the hour. So please, hug the ones who are close to you. Love them in life to the fullest. Because I know Bob did. Rest in peace, my friend.
Is Yasima Fogera here? No. Okay. I was just reminded of a story that I was going to tell about Bob by John, and realized that I'd left out a page. So let me read this. Nothing ever goes as planned, as we all know. Bob's self-reliance and lack of interest in working for others made for a few less than stellar decisions on Bob's part. He made a couple of trips to Panama in his Boston years to oversee some importing, let us say. But the last time he came home, he brought home 2 birds and a coatimundi, which is kind of a raccoon, giant raccoon, which looks like a small bear, which he called Bear. He brought the birds for a friend and Bear for himself. He had all the right papers to import these animals, and he had a stash of bananas to keep them quiet during the flight from Panama to Miami. He carried them onto the plane in closed bags, kept stuffing bananas into the bags, and refused to put them in the overhead bins. But he never told the stewards what he had. As it turned out, that same plane had been hijacked on its last 2 runs. And soon Bob found himself with a gun against his head, as the sky marshal and the stewards nervously demanded that he open the bags. Luckily, his other product was shipped another way. Let us open the floor floor now for anyone who would like to make a brief comment. Just stand or raise your hand. The mic will go around.
My name is Bill Kennedy, and I know Bob through our bridge club. People in front of me are all part of our bridge group. That's how I met Bob. I've known him about 3 years. And as I listened to Reverend Stedman read the sacred words of Ecclesiastes, time for every purpose, I kept waiting for her to say, a time to play bridge.
That's what that translation was.
Bob was very enthusiastic about bridge. So enthusiastic that sometimes I had to calm him down on that big booming voice of his. Other people couldn't concentrate. The first time I met him, I remember him saying that many years ago, he and Maureen made a very difficult decision whether to play bridge or stay married. That marriage thing worked out pretty well for them, so they decided to take up bridge again, and they did it pretty well as a team. They loved each other, they loved the game. We loved their sense of humor, his sense of humor. We're usually pretty quiet, let Bob do most of the talking, at least at the bridge table. Anyway, all of us here who played bridge with him will miss that big voice, will miss that sense of humor, and hope that going forward, he will make every contract that he bids. Rest in peace, Bob. You'll be missed.
Rebecca Hutchinson from here in Deerfield, and we all know Bob had very strong opinions, that he wasn't afraid to share, and he also had a great sense of humor, and I think it's okay to now say that he combined that a few years ago. There was a period of time when he would make banners to put across highways, and he would go into, some people are nodding their heads, they remember, maybe they took part of this. So he had words of wisdom, always of a political nature, and he would get up in early morning or late at night and string them across like Route 93. I knew about it, but I never participated. But a similar thing was that he got me involved in the most crazy visibility I ever tried to do. I think it was for the first Obama campaign, and it was just over the overpass on 101, what we were doing on Obama signs. And so I got up with Bob and Maureen some early morning. We had to be there, of course, for the beginning of the rush hour. But the problem was I forgot how afraid of heights I am. And I didn't think it was very high, that 101. But here we are, it's dark, and we're out there with the Obama signs. And the scary thing is that the cars are going right underneath you. That's what I was totally unprepared for. Anyway, what I remember about that was I only did it that once, and Bob and Maureen were a lot better than I was at, running back and forth across the overpass so they could hit people on both sides to make sure that everybody knew that they were for Obama. It's a fun memory to have now, and I'm glad they got me out there, but I'm not doing it again.
Leslie Van Berkom, I helped organize the coffee houses. As Reverend Fowler mentioned, he did lights for our coffee houses. So I just wanted to say 2 things about his volunteerism. One, he didn't just wait for somebody to ask him, although he would certainly respond to that. He would often look for an opportunity, and he used to attend the coffee houses and saw we used floor lights to light the bands, and said, well, they need real lights. So he went home and he made an amazing set of lights, all colors. Not only made them, but came and put them up every time. And the other thing about his volunteerism is he didn't talk about it, he just did it. And every time he would show up, we were all setting up, he would sort of wing his way through, put it like 60-foot ladder up, climb up the ladder, talking the whole way, usually about politics or something, and put the lights up and come back down and leave. And what he doesn't know is that he would often start conversations about whatever he was joking or talking about as he went up and down the ladder, and they would continue for time after he left. So we are really going to miss him.
like a raccoon, but it has a really long, pointed nose. And that Coatimundi's name was actually Gladly. Gladly, my cross-eyed bear.
With Maureen and Bob growing up. Just wanted to say thank you to Uncle Bob. He's a Renaissance man, he's a tinkerer, he's a ferocious punter, for instilling in me a lifelong love of debate, swap meets, dogs, lawn gnomes, and Tetris.
Hi, I'm Maureen's oldest brother, I guess. I'm the oldest in the family. And when I first met Bob, it was many, many years ago in Roxbury, me and Maureen in Roxbury. I didn't know he even existed. When I walked into the room, I met this giant. And his brother Kerry was also there. He was also even bigger than he was, as I remember. And so I think the first thing that got to me was their size. Much bigger. I think I'm a pretty big guy, but in fact, I'm actually pretty tiny compared to those two. I then kind of dropped out of the family for a long, long time and came back and met Bob and Maureen again, and I got to know Bob a lot better the second time around. One thing that always impressed me, though, from the very beginning of Bob was the fact that his brother, Kerry, was a mathematician, and I'm a mathematician, we're both MIT grads. And I'm always sort of in the cerebral, theoretical, conceptual kind of side of things, and Bob was exactly the opposite in some sense. He was very, very, very practical and incredibly clever, incredibly creative. And in some sense, not in some sense, in a very great sense, I admired him enormously for that, because I'm exactly the opposite. I can't even tie my shoelaces. And Bob would not only design a new pair of shoelaces, he designed a new pair of shoes. And as I got to know him better later in life, I discovered how incredibly creative he was and how impossible it was, some of the things that he did. As the pastor had said earlier, some of the objects he made, some of the musicians that he worked for, some of the musical instruments he designed were absolutely extraordinary. And so whenever I met Bob, I was always in awe, because he had all the things that I had always wanted to be. He was the guy that could always start the impossible engine, or he used to always build the impossible product. And for me, I could sit in this cerebral world of weirdness, multi-dimensional weirdness, but at the same time, I always felt very disconnected from the real world. And he was right there in the middle of it. He actually was the kind of guy that made it happen. And in some sense, as I got to know him a little bit better, I sensed in his part that he was kind of a little sad that he himself does not have all the academic credentials or all the silliness that so many people seem to care about today, whether you're Ivy League educated or whether you're a graduate from a prestigious international university. But the reality is, it's the guys like Bob that actually make the world go round. We need more of them. We don't need more people like me. We need more people like him. And Maureen and everyone else, of course, but I always look forward to seeing him. I am exactly the opposite in political persuasion than he is, but he was in some sense a model. He was something that I always wanted to be.
Bob was my twin sister and I. Bob was our cousin. We grew up spending some vacations and so on with him. But Lake Covesee County drew a memory that our father was very ill, and his family took us off their hands, and we lived in a little tiny cabin on the island of the lake. The two of us had a little tiny cabin, and one day we went screaming to the main house because there was a humongous spider. You know, if you live in Maine or vacation in Maine, you may know these things exist. They're just dinner plate size. And Bob was our hero. He came and he dispatched the spider. I don't know how he did it. He was our hero. He's our age. I went to Worcester with him.
Yay, the College of Worcester. Deep breath.
My name is Amanda. I met Bob and Maureen many years ago. I took care of Miss Gertie prior to her passing, Bob's mom, and had just moved to the town, and I was always fascinated with Bob. I didn't know anybody local, but Bob was always, he had all of the answers for everything. He was so smart, and if I disagreed with anything that he might have been thinking I definitely second-guessed myself and went in his direction because I trusted him. He's been, and both he and Maureen have been, in my heart, like side parents for me here in Deerfield, and have been there for me through so many things. And I'll never forget Bob's smile and his total laughter and sending me messages to learn this song, learn that song, he wanted to hear this or that. And we both shared a love for music, and it was just very, very special in my life. And I will certainly miss him. And I was thinking about people talking about the gigantic size that he was. It's so true, but he would show up yearly, he and Maureen, at my home for my children with little turkeys made out of Oreos. The gentle giant. And it's just Bob. And he's a total blessing to my life, and I just will miss him also.
Have one more.
I wonder if I might be able to do it without the microphone.
At least start without the mic.
Okay. So a lot of you folks know Bob here from Deerfield, and I know a different aspect of Bob. I met Bob 30 years ago on the tennis court. I was playing with my friends, and Bob was on the adjacent court with his friends. And when we all finished, he came across over and introduced himself to me and gave me his business card, and he told me that he was self-employed and had flexible hours and he could play tennis just about any time. So we started it up, and turned out we only lived a mere couple of blocks apart, which was a big advantage. It was just so convenient to spend time with Bob. So we started playing tennis, and we would go back to his home afterwards and have popsicles. And I remember the first time I was at his home. For those of you who never saw his Woburn home, when he showed me around, his furniture was all big and tall. Like even tall for me. And his dogs were big. Everything was big. I hadn't met Maureen yet. I thought she was tall too. Everything was tall. He took me in his tool shop, which was like the size of this church, just crammed full of machinery. More tools than I had ever seen or had any idea what they were. But Bob loved his dogs, and I love dogs too, and I know they're going to be missing him and looking for him. And the pollen's kind of getting to me now, and I'm getting a little choked. So.
Thank you. Clearly there is much to remember about Bob, and he was much loved. And so we know that we will continue sharing memories and stories about him as we go from this place and go forward. We honor his memory, and we celebrate all that he was and all the stories about him. Thank you very much. So it goes.
forward to accept our heaviness of heart and find solace in our own lives. The loss of loved ones shows us that grief is a confusing master. It involves us in a tangle of feelings, many of which are unwelcome. It tries its best to create holes that seem dark and endless and difficult to fill. Grief offers us the kind of sadness that seems to have little focus. It descends and invades when we would prefer it didn't, shrouding our lives with despair at times when we do not expect it. Grief brings loneliness. We lose a friend or a family member. We long for the familiar voice and face that reassures us. We hunger for the comfort and trust that friendship and familiarity bring. Grief brings with it a sense of aloneness. We no longer need to live up to the expectations of another person and must face our own place as an individual, fully responsible in our lives. But amid these feelings which are common to each person, and perhaps even part of the grace of losing someone close, we need to remember that loss is also a many-faceted teacher. Loss to examine our faith and explore our hearts for solid ground, even as we are tempted to forget our strengths and contemplate our weakness. We are challenged by loss to forgive and create new strength in our relationship with the person we have lost and in our connections with those who are still with us. In all of these challenges, we may find fear or feel helpless and confronted by confusion. It is at these times we can turn to family and friends for solace and support that we need to move ahead, to find different meaning in these changes, which are the normal course of our lives. Because most of all, loss gives us the opportunity to explore love. For in the presence of death, it is love on which we must draw in equal measure to our grief. For a time, sadness and loss will mix with love. But as grief is born from love and blooms from love, it is also set aside from love. Bob Mann will not be forgotten. As is so clearly recognized by those of you here today, and by no doubt many others, his faith in himself, his strength in the face of challenges, his creativity and his generosity of character, his commitment to Maureen and his friends, his true spirit resides in some measure in each one of us. With each moment of sadness, loneliness, or confusion, so can a moment of love and joy arise for the strength of spirit Bob showed to each of us through the memories he has left with us. Let us remember his life with joy, even as we recognize his passing with sorrow. Now have a scripture reading.
We read from the Gospel according to Matthew, words of Jesus that illustrate and illuminate the very core of his teaching and his message, which I believe Bob found great meaning in. His message, Jesus' message of love, of justice, and of service. This is illustrative of who Bob was. At the appointed time, the promised one will come in glory, escorted by all the angels of heaven, and will sit upon the royal throne with all the nations assembled below. Then the promised one will separate them from one another as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. The sheep will be placed on the right hand and the goats at the left. Then the ruler will say to those on the right, "Come, you who are blessed by my loving Father God. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you comforted me. In prison, and you came to visit me." Then those gathered, those just, will ask, "When did we see you hungry and feed you, or see you thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or clothe you in your nakedness? When did we see you ill or in prison and come to visit you?" Then the ruler will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, every time you did it for the least of these who are members of my family, you did it for me." Bob lived by this. Here ends the reading. You to join us as we sing Spirit of Life. You'll find the words and music on your insert.
Please join me in prayer. You may be seated if you choose. Spirit of many names and many faces, help me to honor the sadness that brings me here today in your presence. In my sorrow, may I draw solace from my faith and the confidence that your Spirit is within me. In my memories of Bob, help me to understand that his Spirit is within me, though he no longer stands before me. In my sadness, help me to explore new places in myself and in my relationships with my family and my friends as I seek new comfort in my loss. Remind me that I will be released from my sorrow to find joy in the history that I share with Bob. Help me to understand that the passing of Bob and that my love for him can create in me new strength, such that I may live a more full life. Give me the capacity for faith, for stronger awareness, for the freedom of creativity, to honor my memories. Spirit within me, remind me always that the passing of Bob Mann from the presence of the living is a mortal passing, and that in my memory of him and in the love we shared lies the final melding of his spirit with mine. Let us join in a moment of silent prayer. It is these things that we ask in your presence, God. Amen.
Hear now this blessing and benediction. Bob, unto God's gracious mercy and protection we commend your spirit. May the peace which passes all our understanding, the love and joy of God, be yours forever and ever. And may the love of God, the grace of God, and the joy of the Spirit we share with Bob and with God and with our world be with all of you. Amen and amen.